The file appeared at 3:14 in the morning. No press release, no bell from St. Peter's, no cardinal stepping before cameras to explain what had just happened. Only a small change on a Vatican server, a quiet upload into the official document archive marked with a Latin title almost no one outside Rome recognized at first: Nova Lux Veritatis, a new light of truth. At first, it looked like another theological note, the kind of document that normally disappears into the machinery of Catholic bureaucracy. A few pages, a seal, a registration number, the usual language of doctrine, conscience, mercy, and pastoral renewal. But then one Vatican correspondent opened the PDF and stopped breathing. Because on page 2, in language too clear to soften, Pope Leo XIV had done something no one in the room of history expected. He had prohibited 10 teachings that many Catholics had grown up believing were immovable, eternal, carved so deeply into the structure of the Church that to question them felt like touching the foundation stones of faith itself. The correspondent read the line twice, then a third time. By 3:27 a.m., she had sent screenshots to 2 editors in Rome. By 3:41, the first emergency calls were moving through bishops' residences in Europe. By 4:12, 3 seminaries had suspended morning lectures. By dawn, priests on 5 continents were standing in rectory kitchens with coffee going cold in their hands, trying to understand whether the church they served had just entered a new age or a crisis from which it might never fully recover. Inside the Vatican, the silence was worse than any shouting. A junior archivist later said the halls felt like a hospital corridor after a doctor has delivered news no family knows how to receive. No one wanted to speak first. No one wanted to be wrong. Everyone knew the document was authentic. Everyone also knew that if its meaning was exactly what it seemed to be, then the Catholic world had changed while most of it was asleep. Before we go further, take 1 second and subscribe if you follow stories like this. Not because this is gossip, not because this is drama for its own sake, but because what is happening in Rome now is the kind of story that does not end in one video. It moves, it grows, it reaches parishes, families, schools, and the quiet places inside people where faith and fear have been fighting for years. Now let me show you how we got here. The document was not born suddenly. According to people close to the papal household, Pope Leo XIV had been carrying the idea for months in a small, black notebook that never left his desk. On the outside, it looked ordinary: worn corners, thin elastic band, no title, but inside were fragments, scripture references, names of early church fathers, notes from pastoral visits, sentences written in English, Spanish, Italian, and Latin. One line appeared several times: "Mercy cannot be an appendix to doctrine. It must be its face." That sentence became the heart of Nova Lux Veritatis. The document did not announce itself as a revolution. That would have been too easy to dismiss. It called itself a purification of memory, a return to the living gospel, and a correction of teachings that, in the Pope's judgment, had been preached for too long through fear, exclusion, and spiritual control. But no matter how softly it named itself, the impact was violent, because the first teaching it touched was the oldest fear of all: eternal hell. Not the mystery of judgment, not the reality of evil, not the seriousness of sin, but the idea that a soul could be abandoned forever with no door, no appeal, no final movement of mercy, no last dawn beyond the darkness. For centuries, that image had shaped Catholic childhoods, deathbeds, confessions, sermons, family conversations, and the trembling imagination of believers. Many were converted by it. Many were wounded by it. Some lived with a hidden terror that one bad death, one unconfessed sin, one moment of weakness could place them forever beyond the reach of love. Nova Lux Veritatis did not deny that the soul can separate itself from God. It did not deny that evil has consequences. It did not pretend that cruelty, pride, abuse, and hatred are small things. But it drew a line at hopelessness. The text says that God does not create souls for eternal despair. It states that the final horizon of divine justice cannot be revenge without ordained, because justice in God is never separated from mercy. Hell, the document says, may be understood as the soul's radical refusal of love, but it may not be preached as a chamber of irreversible torture from which even God's patience withdraws. That sentence alone was enough to ignite the first fire. At 5:06 a.m., Cardinal Matteo Rinaldi, one of the Vatican's most respected conservative theologians, called a private office inside the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. Witnesses say his voice was calm but cold. "If hell is not eternal," he reportedly said, "then every catechism written in the last 1,000 years has to be read again." He was right. Not because every catechism would be thrown away, but because the emotional architecture beneath them had shifted. Priests could no longer frighten children with endless flames. Funeral homilies could no longer imply that grief was haunted by uncertainty without hope. Confession could no longer be framed as a spiritual courtroom where terror was the main door to repentance. The Pope wanted repentance, but not panic. He wanted conversion, but not spiritual blackmail. By mid-morning, Catholic social media had exploded. Some users wrote that they felt as if chains had fallen from their souls. Others said the Pope had betrayed the gospel. The hashtag "Hell is not the end" crossed languages before noon. Traditionalist priests warned that moral urgency would collapse. Survivors of fear-based preaching said they were crying for the first time in years, without shame. The Vatican did not immediately clarify. That was intentional. Leo XIV had learned that when Rome explains too quickly, everyone hears only the explanation they already wanted. This time, he let the sentence stand in the open air. A clean wound. A necessary one. Then came the second teaching, and it struck not at the afterlife, but at the altar. For 2,000 years, the priesthood had been reserved to men. Women could teach the young, run schools, care for the sick, found orders, lead missions, write theology, preserve parishes, bury the forgotten, and carry the church in places where bishops rarely went. But they could not be ordained. They could not preside at the Eucharist. They could not stand sacramentally in the place reserved by tradition to men. Nova Lux Veritatis called that exclusion no longer teachable as divine will. The line that shook the Vatican was only 11 words. The Holy Spirit does not distribute charisms by gender. By 6:30 a.m., phones were ringing in convents around the world. In Manila, an elderly sister who had spent 40 years forming seminarians reportedly read the line aloud to her community and then sat down because her knees gave out. In Germany, a network of Catholic women theologians issued a statement calling the document the first official opening of a door they had been knocking on for generations. In Brazil, a group of young women in formation live-streamed a prayer of thanksgiving. But inside the Vatican, the mood was not thanksgiving. It was alarm, because the document went further than symbolic language. It ordered seminaries and theological faculties to cease teaching that women are excluded from ordained ministry by an unchangeable divine command. It called for the creation of pathways to study, discern, and form women were instituted and ordained ministries. And most explosively, it announced the appointment of Sister Maria Cecilia of the Cross to the College of Cardinals, with full voice and vote in a future conclave. A woman cardinal. For some, it sounded impossible. For others, overdue. For the old guard, it was not merely a reform. It was a rupture in the bloodstream of Catholic authority. A senior official in the Secretariat of State was heard saying, "Once the conclave is open to this, there is no return." Leo XIV knew that. He had underlined the section twice before signing. According to a person familiar with the draft, the Pope had added one sentence in his own handwriting at the bottom of the page. The body of Christ cannot remain half silent and call itself whole. That sentence did not make it into the final published text, but it circulated through Rome within hours, and by evening, everyone was repeating it. The Pope's defenders said he was restoring balance to a church carried for centuries by women whose authority had been real but unofficial. His critics said he was overturning sacramental theology under the pressure of modern culture. Both sides understood the same thing. The debate was no longer about whether women were important. Everyone admitted that. The debate was about whether the church could keep calling their exclusions sacred. Leo had answered, "Number." And then the third teaching arrived like a quieter blade. Original certita. Citizen. This was not as visible to the public as women's ordination, but theologians knew it was enormous. For centuries, millions of Catholic parents had heard that every child comes into the world marked by original sin. Baptism washed it away. Without baptism, the fate of the child entered painful uncertainty. The word limbo was never defined as formal doctrine, but it lived in the imagination of grieving families like a locked room. Nova Lux Veritatis did not deny that humanity is wounded. It did not deny sin. It did not deny that the human family carries a broken history. But it prohibited teaching that babies are born personally guilty before God. The document called the old formulation a shadow placed over innocence. This line spread more slowly because it required people to understand what had changed. But when it reached parents who had lost children before baptism, the response was immediate and devastating. A mother in Argentina wrote one sentence that was shared millions of times. For 42 years, I was afraid to ask where my daughter was. That sentence did more to explain the reform than any theologian. The Pope's new language reframed original sin as the condition of a wounded world, not a biological stain transmitted like a curse. Human beings are born into fragility, violence, fear, selfishness, and mortality. But they are not born hated. They are not born enemies of God. They are not born carrying a debt they could not choose. Baptism remains sacred, the document says. But it is no longer to be preached as an emergency escape from inherited condemnation. It is a welcome, a covenant, a public belonging, a sacramental beginning. In Rome, some theologians warned that the Pope had weakened the urgency of baptism. Others said he had rescued baptism from fear and returned it to joy. At a parish outside Chicago, a priest reportedly read the passage during morning mass and then closed the document. He looked at the congregation and said, "Some of you have been carrying grief the church never should have added to your grief. Today, lay it down." People wept. That is when the Vatican understood something the opposition had underestimated. These were not abstract doctrines to ordinary Catholics. They were memories, wounds, childhood fears, family stories, confessions whispered through decades. The document was not only changing what could be taught, it was releasing emotions that had been buried beneath obedience. The fourth teaching touched the priesthood from another direction: celibacy. For the Latin Church, celibacy had long been treated as a sacred sign, a total gift, a visible witness that the priest belongs fully to God and to the Church. But over centuries, a discipline had often been preached as if it were the essence of priesthood itself. Many priests carried the burden well. Others carried it in silence, loneliness, repression, or hidden contradiction. Nova Lux Veritatis prohibited teaching that celibacy is essential to ordained ministry. It called celibacy a charism, a gift, a path, but not a universal chain. The document allowed dioceses to begin forming and ordaining married men without exceptional procedures. It permitted priests already ordained to request pastoral pathways toward marriage without automatically losing ministry. And it forbade homilies or seminary instruction that treated marriage as a contamination of priestly holiness. The reaction was not simple. Some older priests read the section with tears. Some younger seminarians panicked. Some bishops feared chaos in formation houses. Others saw an answer to rural communities that had gone months without Mass because there were too few priests. One line became central: human love does not diminish a vocation, it can humanize it. The Pope had written that line after visiting a parish in the Amazon where one priest served 37 communities by boat. A local catechist had told him, "We do not need a perfect, lonely man. We need a pastor who can stay." Leo never forgot it. His critics accused him of using pastoral hardship to dismantle Latin tradition. His defenders responded that the Church itself already knew married clergy and Eastern Catholic rites, and that the question was not whether marriage destroys priesthood, but whether Rome would admit what history already knew. A Polish cardinal called the move a dangerous surrender to emotional culture. A widowed deacon in Canada answered online, "If my marriage taught me patience, forgiveness, and sacrifice, why would those things make me less able to serve God?" That question became one of the day's most shared posts. But the fifth teaching triggered a different kind of storm: salvation only through visible Catholic belonging. The ancient phrase, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, had lived for centuries inside Catholic theology. Outside the Church, no salvation. It had been interpreted, softened, expanded, defended, corrected, and re-explained countless times. Vatican II had opened new language toward other religions, but the instinct remained. The Church possessed the fullness of truth, and others stood in relation to that fullness from the outside. Nova Lux Veritatis pushed beyond careful diplomacy. God is not confined by sacramental borders, it said. Christ is the way, but he is not absent from the ways of others. With that, the document prohibited teaching that non-Catholics are spiritually inferior, automatically deprived of grace, or excluded from salvation by religious identity. It called conversion an invitation, not a threat. It forbade language that described other religions merely as errors tolerated by God until corrected by Catholicism. Within hours, interreligious leaders reacted. A rabbi in New York called it one of the most important gestures of humility Rome has offered in modern history. A Muslim scholar in Indonesia said, "This is not weakness, this is spiritual confidence." A Buddhist teacher in California wrote, "A door has opened, not from one religion to another, but from pride to reverence." Inside the Catholic world, however, reactions split sharply. Missionary communities asked what evangelization meant now. Some feared the Church had emptied itself of urgency. Others said evangelization could finally become witness rather than conquest. Leo XIV's own answer, delivered later in a brief Assisi homily, was simple. Mission is not the replacement of another person's soul. Mission is the offering of Christ without contempt. That sentence calmed some. It enraged others, because beneath the theological language was a deeper question. Can the Church honor truth outside itself without losing confidence in its own truth? The Pope believed yes, and he was willing to risk the argument. The sixth teaching moved back into the afterlife. Purgatory as punishment. For generations, Catholics had prayed for the souls in purgatory, offered masses, lit candles, and imagined a place of painful purification. The devotion could be tender, it could also be terrifying. In some places, the system around it became transactional. Pay for masses, count days, reduce suffering, help the dead move upward. Through a spiritual economy the living could influence. Nova Lux Veritatis did not erase prayer for the dead, it protected it. But it abolished the punitive imagination. Purgatory, the document said, is not a prison of fire where divine anger completes what earthly penance failed to pay. It is the healing encounter of the soul with truth. It is painful only as love is painful when it reveals what we have refused to see. It is purification by light, not punishment by flames. The line that traveled fastest was this: purgatory is the embrace we were not yet ready to receive. That line reached funeral homes, monasteries, and grief groups within hours. For families who had prayed for decades out of fear that loved ones suffered in torment, it offered relief. For traditional preachers, it sounded like sentimental theology. A priest in Guatemala said, "If there is no purifying pain, why pray for the dead?" A Benedictine monk in Minnesota responded, "Because love prays, even when it is not paying a debt." That distinction became the center of debate. Under the new guidelines, masses for the dead remain. Prayers remain. Cemeteries remain sacred places of memory. But no priest may present these prayers as transactions, discounts, or spiritual payments to reduce torment. They are communion. They are love. They are the Church refusing to let death break fellowship. The seventh teaching touched the cross, and here, even supporters of the Pope became quiet, because the cross is not a pseudo-doctrine. It is the center of Christian imagination. The crucifix hangs in churches, schools, hospitals, bedrooms, confessionals, and around the necks of billions. For many Catholics, the language of sacrifice, blood, debt, satisfaction, and atonement has formed the entire meaning of salvation. Nova Lux Veritatis did not deny that Christ died for our sins. It did not deny redemption. It did not deny sacrifice. But it prohibited teaching that God the Father required the punishment of the Son in order to forgive humanity. The document rejected the image of a wrathful father whose anger is satisfied by the suffering of an innocent victim. It described the cross instead as the fullest revelation of divine solidarity, God entering the deepest place of human violence, betrayal, injustice, and death, to show that love does not abandon even there. God does not need blood in order to love. Those 8 words tore through theological circles like a blade. Some called them beautiful. Others called them catastrophic. A seminary professor in the United States warned, "This risks emptying salvation of its objective power." A theologian in Mexico replied, "No, it rescues salvation from the image of divine violence." The Pope knew this section would be misunderstood. He had prepared for it. In the margin of an earlier draft, he wrote, "Do not weaken the cross. Cleanse the image of the Father." That was his purpose. Under the new teaching, catechism classes must no longer present Jesus as a son punished by the Father, so the guilty can go free. Instead, they must teach that Jesus freely gives himself, reveals the Father's mercy, exposes human violence, and opens a path of reconciliation through love stronger than death. The difference is subtle to some. To others, it changes everything. Prayer changes when the Father is no longer imagined as needing blood before offering forgiveness. Penance changes when suffering is no longer treated as a payment to balance an angry ledger. The Mass changes in tone when sacrifice is understood not as divine appeasement, but as the self-offering of love. This was the theological heart of the document, and it terrified Rome, because once the image of God changes, everything downstream changes too. The 8th teaching entered darker territory. Satan. For centuries, Catholic teaching had spoken of the devil as a real, personal being, a fallen angel, a tempter, an adversary. Popular religion went further. Demons behind illness, misfortune, addiction, despair, family conflict, and moral collapse. In some places, fear of demonic forces became the main language of spirituality. Nova Lux Veritatis did not forbid speaking of evil. It forbade teaching Satan as an independent cosmic enemy, locked in battle with God, as if the universe were divided between 2 rival powers. God has no equal opposite, the document says. From this point forward, catechesis must avoid presenting evil as an external monster that allows human beings to avoid responsibility. The figure of Satan may be interpreted symbolically as the shadow of fear, pride, violence, accusation, and refusal of love within the human person and within societies. The reaction was explosive. Exorcists were furious. Some said the Pope had disarmed the Church. Charismatic communities warned that evil is real and active. Psychologists and pastoral counselors welcomed the shift, arguing that many vulnerable people had been harmed by being told their mental illness was demonic. The Vatican clarified that prayers of liberation would continue. Pastoral care would continue. But exorcism manuals would be revised to remove theatrical and magical language, and mental health evaluation would become mandatory before any solemn rite. A Filipino priest interrupted his homily to protest. "If there is no devil," he said, "what did Christ confront in the desert?" By evening, the Pope answered through a short Vatican radio message. Christ confronted the lie that power is greater than trust, spectacle greater than obedience, and domination greater than love. That lie still speaks, but it does not deserve to be worshipped as God's rival. It was classic Leo, calm, precise, uncompromising. The 9th teaching turned toward the end of time, the second coming. For centuries, Catholics had recited the Creed. He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead. Some interpreted this with sober mystery. Others turned it into apocalyptic timelines, end-time panic, signs in wars and earthquakes, speculation about dates, disasters, and cosmic terror. Nova Lux Veritatis prohibited preaching the second coming as a literal geopolitical event, in which Christ returns physically to establish a visible earthly regime of punishment and reward. The document reframed the parousia as the full unveiling of Christ's presence in creation, conscience, justice, mercy, and the final transformation of all things in God. It did not erase hope. It moved hope away from spectacle and into awakening. Christ is not absent, waiting to invade history. The text says, Christ is hidden within history, waiting to be revealed. For many younger Catholics, this was the least controversial section. They had never connected deeply with apocalyptic preaching. For others, especially communities shaped by end times devotion, it felt like theft. What happens to judgment? What happens to resurrection? What happens to the promise that history will not end in human failure? The document answered carefully. Judgment remains. Resurrection remains. Fulfillment remains. But the Church may no longer encourage fear-based speculation, date-setting, or disaster interpretation as signs of an imminent violent return. A priest in Texas posted, "So now Jesus is just a metaphor." A nun in South Korea answered, "No, he is more present than we dare to imagine." That exchange captured the debate. The 10th teaching brought the document to its final and most public conclusion. Outside the Church there is no salvation. The final section was released together with a companion decree titled, Unus Deus Multa Viae. One God, many paths. It opened with the sentence that appeared on every headline by the end of the day. God belongs to no religion. The Church belongs to God. From there, the document prohibited any teaching that salvation is limited to visible Catholic membership, that non-Catholic religions are merely defective shadows, or that baptism functions as an exclusive legal key to divine mercy. Catholic faith remains a path of grace, the decree says, but it is not a border wall around God. Proselytism by fear is forbidden. Mission must become humble witness, service, dialogue, and love. That final point created perhaps the most immediate global response. Interreligious councils praised it. Conservative Catholics denounced it. Secular commentators called it the most dramatic softening of religious exclusivity in modern Christianity. But Leo XIV refused the word softening. In a short address from Assisi, he said, "This is not softness, it is humility before the size of God." The square was silent when he said it. Then he added, "The Church is not a customs office of salvation. She is a house where Christ is offered, not a gate where God is controlled." That became the line. By nightfall, Catholic parishes across the world were divided. Some read the document aloud. Others refused. Some bishops announced study commissions. Others issued warnings. In a cathedral in Poland, a priest placed the printed text on the altar and said he would obey only what tradition had always taught. In a parish in Nairobi, the pastor read the Assisi line, and the congregation stood in applause. Inside the Vatican, emergency meetings continued past midnight. There were 3 factions now. The first wanted immediate implementation, arguing that the Pope had spoken and that the Church had to move forward before resistance hardened. The second wanted clarification, fearful that without careful interpretation the faithful would think the Church had denied its own identity. The third wanted resistance, not public rebellion yet, not formal schism, something quieter, delay, ambiguity. Old textbooks left unchanged. Seminary professors continuing as before. Bishops issuing local guidelines that softened the decree until nothing remained but language. A senior Vatican official called it the old Roman method. When Rome cannot defeat a document, he said, Rome buries it in interpretation. Leo XIV knew that too, which is why the next morning at 6 a.m., he took a step no one expected. He went to the chapel of Santa Marta alone, without cameras, and celebrated Mass with only 12 people present. A theologian, a survivor of spiritual abuse, 2 religious sisters, a married deacon, a young seminarian, a grieving mother, a former atheist, a Muslim guest, a rabbi, a parish priest from the Amazon, and an elderly cardinal who had once opposed him. At the end of Mass, he placed Nova Lux Veritatis on the altar. He did not raise his voice. He said, "This is not a book against the Church. This is a mirror, and mirrors are frightening only when we have forgotten our face." That sentence leaked before breakfast. By noon, the whole world knew it. And that is when the reaction moved beyond theology. Ordinary Catholics began telling stories. A woman who had left the Church after being told her stillborn son might not see God wrote that she prayed for the first time in 20 years. A priest who had secretly loved a woman and lived in torment wrote anonymously that the document did not solve his life, but made him feel seen. A young Catholic woman in the Philippines said she had never imagined that the call she felt toward ministry could be spoken of without mockery. A Jewish teacher wrote that for the first time, a Vatican text sounded less like an invitation to disappear and more like an invitation to speak. But others told different stories. A father in Poland said his children were confused and afraid because the teachings of their childhood seemed to be changing overnight. A Catholic school principal in Ohio said parents were demanding answers she did not have. A retired priest in Rome said he felt as if the floor beneath his entire life had been removed. These reactions mattered because they revealed the true scale of the crisis. The church was not debating 10 ideas on paper. It was debating the memories those ideas had created in people. Fear, shame, obedience, comfort, identity, belonging, the image of God. That is why Nova Lux Veritatis felt so dangerous. It was not simply rewriting doctrine. It was reopening the emotional archive of Catholic life. 3 days after the release, Pope Leo XIV finally spoke publicly in the Clementine Hall. The room was full, but the atmosphere was colder than usual. Cardinals sat without smiling. Journalists stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The Pope entered carrying no staff, no folder, only a single page. He began with one sentence. "I know what you are afraid of." No one moved. "You are afraid that mercy will make sin small. It will not. You are afraid that inclusion will make truth weak. It will not. You are afraid that humility before other religions will make Christ disappear. It will not. You are afraid that if we stop preaching fear, the church will lose control." Then he paused, and perhaps that last fear is the real one. There it was, the line that cut through the room. He continued, "The gospel was never given to us as a system of control. It was given as fire. We have sometimes guarded the ashes and called them tradition. We have sometimes frightened children and called it formation. We have sometimes excluded the wounded and called it purity. We have sometimes defended God as if God were too small to defend himself." A cardinal in the second row lowered his head. Leo's voice remained quiet. "I do not ask the church to abandon mystery. I ask her to abandon cruelty dressed as certainty." That was the moment the room changed. Not because everyone agreed. Many did not. But because everyone understood that the Pope was not improvising. He had decided. He had weighed the risk. He was not backing down. After the address, the Vatican released implementation guidelines. Every seminary would review its curriculum within 90 days. Every bishop's conference would form a pastoral commission. Every catechism program would suspend fear-based lessons on hell, purgatory, Satan, and judgment until revised materials were approved. Every diocese would create listening sessions for those harmed by exclusionary or coercive teaching. And every priest would be required to preach one homily within the next 6 months on the difference between fear and reverence. That last requirement caused laughter in some quarters and fury in others. But Leo insisted. He wanted the distinction clear. Fear shrinks the soul. Reverence opens it. By the end of the week, there were reports of underground resistance. Some priests copied older catechisms and distributed them privately. Some Catholic influencers declared the Pope an enemy of tradition. Several cardinals requested an extraordinary doctrinal council. A few even whispered about the possibility of formal correction. But support was growing too. In Latin America, vigils filled public squares. In the United States, university chapels hosted debates that overflowed into hallways. In Africa, reactions were mixed but intense. Some bishops rejected the reforms, while many lay Catholics welcomed the language of dignity and mercy. In Europe, theologians called it the most ambitious doctrinal shift since Vatican II. In Asia, young Catholics began translating sections into local languages before official versions could be released. The Vatican had tried for centuries to control the pace of doctrinal reception. This time the people moved faster. That frightened the old guard more than the document itself. Because once people begin to ask whether fear had been mistaken for faith, the question cannot easily be put back in the drawer. And Leo XIV understood this better than anyone. On the 7th night after the release, he walked alone through the Vatican gardens. According to a guard who saw him, the Pope stopped near an old fountain, opened his black notebook, and wrote for several minutes under a small lamp. No one knows exactly what he wrote, but the next morning a page appeared in the papal chapel, left beside the altar, unsigned, but unmistakably in his handwriting. It contained only 4 lines. "Let doctrine serve love. Let tradition remember mercy. Let authority kneel before truth. Let the church stop frightening those Christ came to heal." Within hours, a photograph of the page had spread around the world. For his opponents, it confirmed their fear. The Pope was turning Catholicism into emotional spirituality. For his supporters, it confirmed their hope. The Pope was bringing Catholicism back to the face of Jesus. The truth may be more complicated, because reform at this depth never arrives clean. It brings grace and confusion together. It heals some wounds and opens others. It gives language to those who had none, while unsettling those whose faith was built on older certainties. It creates space, but space can feel like freedom or like falling, depending on where you are standing. That is why the next months may determine whether Nova Lux Veritatis becomes a path of renewal or the beginning of a deeper rupture. There are three possible futures now being discussed quietly in Rome. The first is reception. Bishops implement the document. Theologians explain it carefully. Parishes learn to speak of mercy without denying sin. And the Church enters a difficult but fruitful period of reform. This is the future the Pope wants. The second is fragmentation. Some regions obey, others resist, and Catholicism begins to look different from country to country. The same church on paper, but divided in practice. This is what many bishops fear. The third is open revolt. A group of cardinals declares that the document contradicts the deposit of faith, refuses implementation, and calls for a council to judge the Pope's authority. No one wants to say the word schism, but everyone knows it is in the room. Leo XIV knows it too, and yet those close to him say he is calm, not because he underestimates the crisis, but because he believes the crisis was already there. The document did not create the wound, it exposed it. That may be the deepest truth of this story. Nova Lux Veritatis did not simply prohibit 10 teachings. It asked whether the Church can still speak credibly to souls formed by trauma, science, pluralism, grief, and a longing for a God whose mercy is not smaller than human fear. It asked whether doctrine can be faithful without being cruel, whether tradition can be strong without being frozen, whether authority can guide without controlling, whether the Church can admit that some of its language, even when sincerely defended, wounded people it was meant to save. The world is watching because this is not only a Catholic question. Every institution eventually faces the same test. Does it protect what gave it life? Or does it protect the systems that grew around that life? Does it serve the people, or demand that the people serve its memory? Does it fear change because change is dangerous, or because change reveals how much had already gone wrong? Pope Leo XIV has placed that question on the altar of Rome, and he has left it there for the whole world to see. The final scene, at least for now, happened at Assisi, not in the Apostolic Palace, not under chandeliers, not behind a desk, in the city of Francis, before a small crowd of religious leaders, ordinary Catholics, skeptics, pilgrims, and journalists. Leo stood in a plain white cassock and read the closing line of Unus Deus multe viae. The Church does not own God. She witnesses to him. Then he closed the document. For a few seconds, there was no applause, only wind moving through the square. Then, an elderly woman near the front began to cry. A young priest bowed his head. A rabbi placed his hand over his heart. A Muslim guest looked down at the ground, visibly moved, and somewhere in the back, a man who had not entered a church in 30 years whispered, "Maybe I can come back." That is the power of a sentence when it arrives at the right hour. The document has been signed, the old formulas have been challenged, the bishops are deciding, the faithful are speaking, the critics are mobilizing, the Pope is waiting, and nothing in the Catholic Church feels untouched. If this story moved you, share it with someone who has wrestled with fear, faith, and the image of God. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and which of these 10 changes struck you the deepest. Subscribe for more Vatican documentary stories, because this is not finished. The folder has been opened, and once light enters a sealed room, the room is never dark in the same way again.